Deep inside Kenya's thick Ngoro forest, under the cold silver moonlight, a terrified 14-year-old girl named Zuri stumbled through the trees. Her stepfather, Bako, dragged her by the arm, his grip cruel and unshaking. The night was silent except for the rustle of leaves and Zuri's quiet sobs. She begged him to stop, but Bako's heart was darker than the forest around them. When they reached a lonely clearing, he pushed her to the ground. "You should have never been born," he hissed. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her trembling in the dirt. He later told her mother, Lindai, that Zuri had run away, but that was a lie. He had left her there to die. As his footsteps faded, the forest came alive with whispers and distant growls. Hyenas laughed in the distance, their voices echoing through the night. Zuri curled up, shaking, her tears mixing with the earth beneath her. She thought it was the end. But the forest, vast, ancient, and alive, had other plans for her. The wind seemed to move around her gently, the trees creaked like they were speaking to her. Somewhere deep in that dark wilderness, something watched over the broken girl. Though she didn't know it yet, this cruel night was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of how the forest would turn her pain into power, and her fear into a destiny far greater than she could ever imagine. Days slowly turned into weeks, and in the small village beyond the Ngoro forest, everyone believed Zuri was gone forever. Her mother, Lindai, cried by the river every morning, whispering her daughter's name into the wind. People shook their heads and said, "The forest took her." No one dared to go looking. The forest was wild, full of snakes, hyenas, and secrets. But deep inside that same forest, Zuri was still alive. Weak, hungry, and scared, she wandered for days, living on berries and rainwater. Her clothes were torn, and her body was covered in scratches. She thought she might die, until one morning, she woke up in a small wooden hut. A warm fire burned beside her, and a gentle voice said, "Rest, child." Standing over her was an old man with kind eyes and gray hair. His name was Omari, a hunter who lived alone in the forest. Years ago, war had taken his wife and children, and he had chosen to live away from people. Omari cared for Zuri like she was his own. He cleaned her wounds with herbs, fed her warm stew, and gave her a place to sleep. When she asked why he helped her, he simply smiled and said, "The forest protects those with clean hearts." Under his care, Zuri grew stronger each day. He taught her how to track animals, find water, and listen to the sounds of nature. She learned which plants healed and which ones harmed. At night, they sat by the fire as Omari told her stories about the spirit of the forest, how it watched over the innocent and punished the cruel. For the first time in her life, Zuri felt safe. The fear that once filled her heart began to fade. The forest, which once felt like a grave, now felt like home. She didn't know it yet, but these lessons would make her stronger than she ever imagined. The girl who was left to die was learning to live, and one day, she would return not as a victim, but as someone the whole village would never forget. As months passed, Zuri became one with the forest. Every morning she followed Omari through the misty trees, learning how to track the prints of animals and move silently over dry leaves. She learned to heal wounds using wild herbs and to make fire even when the rain poured. The girl who once feared every sound in the night now walked through the jungle with confidence. She could hear the whispers of the forest, the rustling leaves, the calling birds, the river's hum, and she felt it all speak to her. Omari would smile proudly and say, "You belong here now, child. The forest has accepted you." But far away, in the village, life had moved on. Zuri's stepfather, Bako, was growing richer every day. He had taken all the land and wealth that once belonged to Zuri's late father. He wore fine clothes, sat with the elders, and spoke as if he had earned everything with his own hands. No one dared to question him. People pitied Lindai, Zuri's mother, who had grown quiet and thin. She no longer smiled or joined the village gatherings. Each day, she walked to the river and knelt on the stones, praying softly for her daughter's spirit to find peace. Sometimes she thought she could hear Zuri's laughter in the wind, but she always told herself it was only her imagination. Then one night, everything changed. As Lindiu slept, she dreamt of her daughter standing tall and strong. Zuri looked older, her skin glowing like bronze under the sun. Beside her stood a great lion with golden eyes, its mane shining like fire. Zuri smiled, holding her hand out to her mother, and said, "Mama, I am not gone. The forest has kept me." Lindiu woke up gasping, her heart racing. She looked out toward the dark trees beyond the village and felt tears fill her eyes. Deep down, she knew the truth, her daughter was alive. The forest that once took her child had not swallowed her in death, it was shaping her for something far greater. 7 years had passed since the night Zuri disappeared. The people of the village had moved on, though her story still haunted whispers around fires. Every year during the harvest festival, her mother, Lindiu, laid a small basket of fruit by the river and prayed for her lost child. This year, the air felt different, heavier, charged with something no one could explain. As the villagers danced and sang, the sound of strange drums rolled through the valley. It wasn't the rhythm of their own musicians. It came from deep within the forest, slow, steady, powerful, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The dancing stopped. Everyone turned toward the trees. Out of the shadows, a tall woman began to walk toward the village. Her skin glowed in the sun, and her clothes shimmered with golden beads and tribal ornaments. Around her neck hung an amulet shaped like the rising sun. Her steps were calm but commanding, her eyes sharp and bright, eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's soul. The closer she came, the quieter the crowd grew. Some gasped. Others stepped back, whispering prayers under their breath, thinking they were seeing a spirit from the forest. Lindiu froze where she stood, her heart pounding. She knew those eyes. Even after 7 long years, a mother could never forget her child. "Zuri," she whispered. The name fell from her lips like a prayer. The woman stopped and smiled softly, and in that single moment, everyone knew. It was her, the girl they thought the forest had claimed forever. But this was no lost girl. This was a queen. Behind her, warriors dressed in colorful traditional garments followed, carrying drums, baskets, and spears decorated with feathers. The village that once mourned her now stood in awe, staring at the woman who had walked out of the forest like a legend reborn. Behind Zuri came a group of men and women dressed in beautiful warrior garments, their faces painted with bright colors of red and gold. Each step they took made the ground seem to hum with pride and power. These were not just followers, they were her people, the ones who had found her in the forest and made her their queen. They carried baskets overflowing with food, fruits, and grains. Some held bundles of herbs and jars of medicine made from plants deep in the jungle. The air was filled with the scent of honey, smoke, and wildflowers. Every villager stared in silence, not sure whether to bow or to run. Zuri walked with grace and strength, her gold ornaments glinting in the sunlight. Though she said nothing at first, her eyes spoke louder than any words could. She was no longer the frightened child who had once been dragged into the forest. She stood tall now, calm, powerful, and unshaken. The people who once turned their backs on her could barely meet her gaze. Children peeked from behind their mothers, whispering, "Is she a spirit?" But the elders knew better. They felt it in their bones, Zuri had become something greater than they could understand. The chief, an old man known for his pride, stepped forward slowly. His hands trembled as he looked at her. Then, to everyone's shock, he bowed deeply before her. The crowd gasped. It was the first time anyone had seen the chief bow to another person. Zuri nodded gently, her expression calm and kind. "I bring gifts," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not for revenge, but for peace." The warriors behind her lowered their baskets, setting them before the people who had once abandoned her. The village stood still, their shame mixing with wonder. The girl they left to die had returned as their queen, and she came bearing kindness instead of anger. As the drums faded and whispers filled the air, one man stood frozen among the crowd, Bako. His hands trembled, his lips pressed tight as he stared at the woman walking toward the center of the village. He could not believe what his eyes saw. Zuri. The girl he had left to die in the forest. The one he had sworn would never return. For a moment, he thought it was a ghost come to punish him. His face went pale, his breath quickened, and sweat rolled down his neck. Slowly, Zuri turned her gaze toward him. The noise of the crowd disappeared, leaving only the crackling of the festival fires. Their eyes met, hers calm and piercing, his wild with fear. Bako took a step back, then another. He turned as if to run, but her voice stopped him cold. Father. One word, sharp and clear, echoing through the valley. The air itself seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent, their eyes shifting between them. Zuri took another step forward, raising her hand. In her palm glimmered an old amulet, her father's amulet, carved from bone and tied with red thread. The people recognized it instantly. It was the same one Zuri's father had worn every day before his death. Gasps filled the air. Bako's mouth opened, but no words came out. His body shook as Zuri spoke softly, "You took his life for gold, didn't you?" The chief stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "Is this true?" he demanded. Bako stumbled, muttering excuses, but Zuri lifted the amulet high for all to see. "This was found in your old hut," she said. "My father's blood, your greed, and your lies, all buried in the forest." The crowd erupted in shock and fury. Women shouted, men clenched their fists. Bako dropped to his knees, begging, but no one came to his defense. The truth had finally come to light. The man who once had everything now knelt before the girl he had tried to destroy, the girl who had returned with the strength of the forest in her soul. The crowd surrounded Bako, their anger rising like a storm. Some shouted for him to be punished, others demanded the elders to take him away. But before anyone could move, Zuri lifted her hand, and the noise died instantly. The air grew still again, the fires flickering against her golden jewelry. Her face was calm, her voice steady as she spoke, "I came not for revenge, but for justice." Her words hung heavy in the night, cutting through the anger like a knife. Everyone fell silent, waiting for what she would say next. Zuri stepped forward and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in animal skin. She untied it carefully and revealed a set of old papers, worn and yellowed by time. "These were hidden by my father before he died," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Bako. "The forest kept them safe until I was ready." She handed the papers to the chief, who unfolded them slowly, his eyes widening as he read. They were deeds, official documents proving that the land Bako had claimed as his own still legally belonged to Zuri's family. Every farm, every field, every coin of wealth he had built came from what he stole. The people began to murmur, realizing what it meant. Bako's face turned gray, his mouth trembling as he tried to speak. But Zuri didn't look at him with hate. She looked at him with calm strength. "You took my father's life," she said. "You took what was ours. But today, I take back only what belongs to me, nothing more." The chief raised his hand. "By the laws of this land, the inheritance returns to Zuri, daughter of the late Mosi," he declared. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the valley. Bako collapsed to the ground, his stolen empire crumbling in an instant. Zuri stood tall, her eyes shining not with pride, but with peace. She had not come to destroy. She had come to set things right, and that, the people knew, was the true power of a queen. The elders stepped forward, their faces hard and solemn. Without a word, they took hold of Bako's arms. His body trembled as they led him away, his head hanging low. The man who once walked proudly through the village, feared and respected, was now nothing more than a shadow of himself. The people watched in silence as he disappeared into the darkness, his cries echoing faintly before fading away. Justice had been done. But instead of celebrating his fall, the crowd turned their eyes back to Zuri, the girl who had returned from death to restore truth. As the drums went quiet, a soft sob broke the silence. Lindai, Zuri's mother, stumbled forward. Her hands shook as she fell to her knees before her daughter. Tears streamed down her face as she cried, "My child, forgive me. I was blind. I believed his lies. I failed you." Her voice cracked, her body shaking with years of guilt and sorrow. The villagers looked on, hearts heavy with emotion. Zuri knelt beside her mother and gently lifted her up. She wiped away her tears with a soft hand and whispered, "The forest forgave me. So must I forgive you." Her voice was calm, full of love and peace. The crowd gasped softly. In that moment, Zuri's strength wasn't in her power or her crown, it was in her mercy. She pulled her mother into her arms, holding her tightly as Lindai wept against her shoulder. All around them, the villagers began to cry too, not out of fear, but out of awe. They saw a young woman who had every reason to hate, yet chose to heal instead. The air filled with quiet sobs and murmurs of respect. The wind blew gently through the trees, as if the forest itself was watching. Zuri looked up at the sky, her golden ornaments glinting in the fading light, and smiled softly. The same forest that had once been her prison had now become her witness, a witness to her courage, her forgiveness, and her unbreakable heart. Months passed, and the village began to change. The once quiet land that had been stained with greed and pain was now filled with life again. On her father's old land, Zuri built something that would last for generations. With her people from the forest and the help of villagers who now followed her with pride, she built a school and a small clinic. The buildings were simple, made from wood, clay, and stone, but they stood tall and strong, surrounded by gardens filled with bright flowers and fruit trees. Every morning, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the fields, mixing with the songs of birds and the whisper of the wind. Zuri wanted it to be more than just a place to learn or heal. She wanted it to be a home for those who had been forgotten, the widows, the orphans, and the girls who had no one to protect them. She remembered her own pain, the nights she cried alone, and she vowed that no child in her village would ever feel that kind of loneliness again. She gave work to those who had been cast aside. Women cooked and taught, young men helped build and farm, and together they created a community born out of kindness. People began to travel from faraway villages to see what they called the forest's heart. They came for medicine, for learning, and for hope. Zuri walked among them each day, helping where she could, her smile warm and her voice gentle. The forest that had once saved her now gave life to everyone around her. At sunset, Zuri often stood beneath the great trees, watching the children run and play. The golden light touched her face, and for a moment, she felt the forest breathe beside her. She whispered softly, "You gave me life. Now I give life to others." And deep within the woods, the wind carried her words like a song, a promise kept by the girl who had once been left to die, but had returned to heal the world. The day of the opening was bright and full of joy. The whole village gathered on Zuri's father's old land, now reborn with new life. Children ran around with flowers in their hands, women sang songs of hope, and men beat drums that echoed through the valley. The air smelled of roasted maize and honey, and colorful cloths waved like flags in the wind. The school stood proudly beside the small clinic, both freshly painted with tribal patterns and symbols of unity. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read, "The Forest's Heart." Zuri stood before the crowd in a flowing white dress decorated with golden beads. Around her neck hung the same amulet that once belonged to her father, now shining in the sunlight. Her mother, Lindai, stood beside her, tears glistening in her eyes, her face glowing with pride. The people who had once pitied her now looked at her daughter with deep respect, their hearts full of admiration. When the drums stopped, the chief stepped forward. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he looked at Zuri. "This land once saw sorrow," he began. "A young girl was thrown to the beasts, left to die among them. But today, she stands before us, not as a victim, but as their queen. The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping and ululating until the air itself seemed to dance with their voices. Zuri smiled, her eyes glistening as she looked toward the horizon. Behind her, the Ngoro forest stood tall and silent, its leaves shimmering under the sun as if alive. The wind moved gently through the trees, whispering like an old friend, wrapping her in a warm, invisible embrace. For a moment, she closed her eyes and listened. She could almost hear Omari's voice saying, "The forest protects those with clean hearts." Zuri lifted her head, her heart full of peace. The forest had once saved her life. Now, it stood proudly behind her, a witness to her strength, her forgiveness, and her destiny fulfilled. That night, the village was alive with music, laughter, and the warm glow of firelight. Drums echoed deep into the forest, and people danced barefoot on the earth that once held so much sorrow. Children ran between the fires, their hands full of sweet fruit, while elders sat in circles telling stories about the girl who had returned from the wild. For the first time in years, the village felt whole again. Everywhere she went, people called her name, smiling, bowing, thanking her for what she had done. But Zuri didn't stand in the center of the celebration. She had quietly stepped away, choosing to sit by the edge of the forest, where the trees met the moonlight. The soft glow of the full moon touched her face, and she felt the night breeze wrap around her like an old friend. She looked down at her arm, the same arm that still carried the long scar from the night her stepfather left her to die. The mark shone faintly in the light, a pale reminder of her past. For years, she had hated that scar, covering it whenever she could. It reminded her of fear, betrayal, and pain. But now, sitting beneath the stars, she saw it differently. It was no longer a wound. It was proof that she had survived. Zuri ran her fingers gently over the scar and smiled. "You tried to break me," she whispered to the wind, "but you only made me stronger." The forest around her seemed to answer, the leaves rustling softly as if in agreement. She lifted her eyes to the sky, her heart steady and full. That scar, once a symbol of suffering, had become her crown, a mark of strength, courage, and rebirth. As the drums continued to beat behind her, Zuri stood, the moon shining over her like a blessing. In her heart, there was no pain left, only power. She knew then that even the deepest betrayal could give birth to royalty, and her story was living proof of it. As the night grew quiet and the fires burned low, the laughter and songs began to fade. The people slowly returned to their homes, their hearts full, their spirits light. Only the sound of the crickets and the soft crackle of dying flames remained. Zuri stood alone at the edge of the village, looking out toward the dark forest that had once swallowed her whole. The moon hung high above, silver and calm, painting the trees in soft light. It was the same forest that had once terrified her, the same place where she had cried for help and thought no one would ever hear. Yet it had been her greatest teacher, her protector, her destiny. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind moving gently through the leaves. It sounded like whispers, voices of the past, of Omari, of her father, and of the forest itself. She felt peace wash over her. Everything that had once broken her now felt like it had been part of a greater plan. The pain, the loss, the betrayal, all of it had shaped her into the woman she had become. Zuri took a deep breath and smiled softly. Her gold jewelry shimmered faintly under the moonlight as she whispered into the night, "What they meant for death, the forest turned into destiny." Her words floated into the trees, carried by the wind like a sacred promise. The branches swayed as if the forest itself was answering her, a quiet murmur of pride and love. Then she turned back toward the village, her steps light and sure. The drums had stopped, but her story had just begun, a story that would be told for generations about the girl who was left to die and returned as a queen chosen by the forest itself.